Okay, so my name is Fan Lei. I grew up right outside Midway Airport. I now live in Bridgeport, and I just quit my job as a software engineer to pursue activism full time. So that's why I'm holding this workshop. So first thing we need to establish is where Chinatown is. So where is Chinatown? You can answer in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. Um, does anybody have any ideas where Chinatown is? So Chinatown, yeah, Cermak and Wentworth is a good way to describe it. When we think about Chinatown, there's usually a particular red line stop we get off at or a particular set of intersections. But the answer to this isn't as straightforward as you might think it is, because Chinatown actually isn't considered part of these 77 official neighborhoods in Chicago, because Chinatown is part of Armour Square, which is one of those 77 neighborhoods, but Chinatown itself can mean different things depending on the speaker. And this is what I mean by it. So Chinatown can mean different things. So these are two different maps of what is considered Chinatown. On the left, you have core Chinatown, which was defined by the Coalition for a Better Chinese Community. And the boundaries of the core include the Dan Ryan Expressway, the Stevenson Expressway, as well as the South Branch of the Chicago River. And it's also bounded by Clark Street on the east. So many of us are familiar with this part of Chinatown, which includes Pington Park, the Chinatown Square, a lot of gift shops, right? Actually, if you look just south of Cermak Avenue, a huge part of Chinatown also includes all of these residential streets. So many of us are familiar with all the traditional architecture that makes Chinatown look very orientalized. But actually, if you take a stroll through some of these neighboring streets, the houses look very normal, and you might not even realize that you're in Chinatown if you just walk through them. There's also a really tiny park down here if you guys never visited it. And then on the right side, we have a larger view of the Chicago map. And these boundaries still include Chinatown because a large percentage of the population here is of Asian descent and Chinese descent. And the reason why this is considered Chinatown is because there's a lot of Asian people. And it includes neighborhoods like Bridgeport, where I live, McKinley Park, Canaryville. There's a growing population of Chinese people in Canaryville. There's a lot of Chinese people in the near south side, as well as far as Brighton Park. And so depending on the speaker, Chinatown can mean either of these two maps. And so it's important to recognize how that speaker is defining Chinatown, because they both carry different political meanings, and they're represented by different people in city council and in the state representative. So if you see here, 88% of Chinatown core is Asian, whereas the greater Chinatown area is 30% Asian and about 30% Hispanic, 28% white, and 10% Black. So 30% Asian is still a disproportionately high number, but there's also a lot of interracial mixing going on in this area as well. So other things to know about this area, 26% population increase was what it saw between 2000 and 2010. And then 66% of Chinatown's core is foreign born. So think about what that means in terms of the types of services there that people need. And then also the greater Chinatown area consists of 4 different wards. So what that means is that when you have certain political boundaries, there are 4 different people representing Chinatown. So Chinatown core is represented by the 25th Ward Alderman, Byron Siccho Lopez. But, as you can see, not a lot of people on this, or nobody in this picture is Asian. And actually the Chinatown area, not a single part of it has ever been represented by an Asian American city council member. And so Asian people have been living in this country, in China, in Chicago's Chinatown specifically, for over 100 years. And so start thinking about what that means, because we're going to get into it a little later. Like there is a lot of desire from the community for somebody who looks like them to represent them in City Hall. So before we get into the specifics of Chicago's Chinatown, I have to do my due diligence and make sure that we are all starting with a same set of core knowledge about the Asian American experience. I can't cover all of that in just 10, 15 minutes. So I'll just go over the parts that I think are really relevant to the formation of Chinatown. So one of the things that I'd like us to think about is the anti-Chinese movement. It started off as more of a fringe movement, but it actually became incredibly powerful in defining racial relations in the United States and racism. And here in this cartoon, you see this ad for the Working Men's Party of California. And the Working Men's Party of California was just one of many different political parties and organizations that were able to galvanize anti-Chinese sentiment from wider society and use that as their platform in order to gain political power. And so there's this leg labeled WPC, and it's trying to kick out the Chinese people from California and send them back to China. And there's this phrase at the top that says, "The Chinese must go." And this was coined by Dennis Kearney, who's the leader of the Working Men's Party. And so this became kind of the mantra of the West, where there was such a concentration of Chinese people that the white laborers felt incredibly threatened by their peasants. And so there was definitely this contradiction between racism and nativism and the desire for many of these companies to keep Chinese laborers around because they were cheap labor. So because of this tension between this desire for cheap labor and these white laborers not wanting Chinese people around them, a lot of political violence erupted. And some of the deadliest lynchings in US history involved Chinese people. So in 1877, there was the San Francisco massacre. And then 1871, there was the Los Angeles one, which is one of the most well-known ones. And then the 1885 Rock Springs massacre in Wyoming. And actually, I recommend that people read about this one specifically because the way it was written was like very detailed and it was very sad. It evoked a lot of sad emotions for me reading it because what happened was there were white miners who were consistently being undermined by their bosses when they were trying to fight for better wages and working conditions in the mines. And because Chinese people were consistently brought in as strikebreakers, they got fed up to the point that they let out all their anger and feelings of oppression at the Chinese people living in the Chinatown nearby. And so they destroyed the Chinatown. There were women and children involved in the lynching. And so I think it's a sad story because it was a perfect example of how everybody under this system of capitalism is pitted against each other, regardless of, the feelings of prejudice and discrimination we might have and the suspicions. At the end of the day, nobody won out. Neither the white laborers or the Chinese people got what they wanted out of this. And the only people who benefited were the people who owned the mines. And then we also have the 1887 Deep Creek, Oregon massacre, where the bodies of 34 Chinese miners were found, and they were also found to be tortured afterward. So then we get to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And how I mentioned earlier that, the white anti-Chinese movement started off as fringe because that pretty much originated in the West Coast. If you think about it, it's kind of incredible that they were able to gain so much political power that they were able to win seats in office. and take control of cities. The Working Men's Party of California were able to do that. And they were also able to convince Congress to shut Chinese out of this country, Chinese laborers specifically. And so I think that's kind of interesting. And it really shows like how powerful this movement was in shaping this country and its laws. So these are some examples of Chinese exclusion acts. This was the 1875 Page Act. That was actually, I would say, the first Chinese Exclusion Act before the 1882 one. I'm not exactly sure why this one isn't studied or as well known, but what it practically did was target Chinese women and excluded them. And that was because they were seen and racialized in a very specific way, where they were considered prostitutes, they were considered threats to the institution of marriage in this country. And it was also based on this misunderstanding that Chinese people were not assimilable because they had specific types of marital structures. And so polygamy was a common practice among Chinese immigrants for a lot of different reasons. One of those reasons was due to the very nature of immigration itself. If you can imagine the experience of Chinese people, if they immigrate here and they have a lot of trouble getting their families to immigrate over due to the Chinese Exclusion Acts, they would often remarry in this country, or they would have second wives. The practice of having second wives and concubines was very normal back in certain parts of China. Then we get to the 1882 Exclusion Act, which foreshadowed a very long succession of targeting other countries in Asia, like Japan and the Philippines. And then the 1943 Magnuson Act. And what this did was repeal the Exclusion Act, but it enacted a quota of 105 people per year. And this was a disproportionately low number because it should have been closer to about 2,000. And not only that, it was enacted, it was enforced in a very racist manner. So it didn't matter at this time if you were a Chinese person from Hong Kong or from Macau or from Canada or Mexico. If you were of Chinese ethnic heritage, this quota counted, you counted toward this quota. And this way of applying the quota was not relevant to any of the other quotas at this time. And then lastly, we get to the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, or Nationality Act. And I think this one is incredibly misunderstood because a lot of people see this act as kind of a beacon of progress or a moment where America overcame its racist history. But racism still exists today, right? So it would seem kind of incongruous to think that this specific piece of legislation is not relevant or does not also still exist in the institutional racism that we have today. So the Immigration and Nationality Act, you could read more about it, but we need to think of it as something that still existed in the context of racism, because it was still written in a racist way, because even though it repealed quotas, it still applied, it still had a way of excluding people through visas. And what kind of visas? Usually visas like visas that favored high-tech, high-skilled laborers, and also family reunification. And people think of this as like a moment of progress in American history because it opened the gates to immigration from Asia and South and Central America. But actually, those things were unintended consequences. The writers of this law never intended for that to happen. And so when we think about that, we need to think about what other factors influence this law, things like capitalism, racism, and the way that the economy was restructured during this time. So the next part I want to talk about is this concept of an ethnic enclave. And ethnic enclaves refer to a community that maintains a strong sense of ethnic or national identity within another country. And so Chinatown is an ethnic enclave. And there's a lot of literature about how these ethnic enclaves form, and what their characteristics are. And ethnic enclaves don't just have to be in a city or in an urban area. They can be in the middle of nowhere. They can be in a suburb. The San Gabriel Valley in LA, or in California is a really good example of an ethnic enclave. It has a high density of Asian people, but it's actually a suburb. And you can have an ethnic enclave with European immigrants, as long as it's an ethnic minority that is very different from its majority country. So this is a quote from one of Chicago Chinatown's leaders. She said, "Chinatowns didn't form in North America out of the desire for convenient Chinese food nearby. They started because of discrimination and redlining. Chinese immigrants were restricted in where they can live, um, in where they can live." Sorry. So what she's getting at here is that there's a very common a belief that Chinatowns and ethnic enclaves form because of the natural tendency to be close to kin and to be close to people you're familiar with, which is, you know, a real probable reason, but it's not the entire picture. And if we don't look at the external factors that lead to self-segregation, we're missing half the picture. So when we look at why Chinatowns form, we see a lot of the common themes. We see that over 200 Chinatowns were burned down or otherwise destroyed by the 1800s. This was a direct quote, but I think it means like within the 1800s. And then we see that a lot of Chinatowns end up being butted up against vice districts or red light districts where there's a lot of illegal activity going on. And then there's a lot of common rhetoric about filth and disease as stereotypes of Chinese ethnic enclaves and Chinatowns. And these ideas about filth and disease often apply to any type of undesirable ethnic enclave. So not just Chinese people, but you know, it's been really there's a very common pattern to the way Chinatowns are described throughout history, and I'll explain more here. So this is a headline from the Chicago Tribune in 1876. It says, "Chinatown pronounced by the health officer a laboratory of infection." That might ring some bells about the 2020 pandemic. But in the article, the health inspector says, "I unhesitatingly declare that this cause to smallpox is the presence in our midst of 30,000 of unscrupulous, lying, and treacherous Chinamen who have degraded our unsanitary laws." So I'm going to read this part out loud, and it's kind of dense, but I think the writing is really good here. And this is by Nayan Shaw, and her article should be linked into your RSVP email, and I encourage you to read it if you have time. But they make a really good connection between how the rhetoric of disease and filth become inherent to the way Chinese people themselves are characterized, and how these things become the basis for racism itself. Okay, let me just take a sip of water before I do this. Okay, I gotta get ready. Okay, periodic public health investigations, both formal and midnight journeys and official fact-finding missions, fed the alarm about the danger Chinese men and women pose to white Americans' health. Not only was Chinatown characterized as the rankest growth of human degradation that can be found upon this earth, but authorities suggested no amount of cleansing could improve these conditions. Disease was conceived as organic to every Chinese racialized space. Inhuman living conditions appeared to be inseparable from the very nature of the race, and the city authorities warned that Chinatown would remain a cesspool so long as it is inhabited by people of the Mongolian race. The practices of scientific investigations and fact-finding missions persuasively define the truth of Chinatown in terms of constricted, crowded, immoral, unsanitary, and unnavigable spaces. These discursive practices profoundly affected the lives of Chinese men and women in San Francisco. And feel free to write anything in the chat box if something is confusing or if you have any comments. Sorry for like that dense reading, but what they're saying here is that there would be these scientific reports about Chinatown that often would borrow language from racist organizations like the Working Men's Party or the anti-coolie associations. And when you have that very blurred line between what is scientific and what is racist, um, then it becomes a question of, well, what is the whole purpose of these scientific investigations to begin with, if they're not really objective? I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea that phrenology, or the way that skulls were measured back in like the 19th century, was used to justify racism through the guise of scientific objectivity. This is kind of like that as well, where we had public health inspectors going in, looking into these Chinatowns, but only at night, to see what the true character of these Chinatowns were. Okay, now we get to Chicago Chinatown, the part where everybody was waiting for. So many of you may know that old Chinatown preceded the Chinatown that we are familiar with. And the Chinatown that we know didn't exist until 1912. Old Chinatown existed in the South Loop, and it was primarily on Clark Street between Harrison and Van Buren. So there are a lot of factors that led to Chinese people migrating from the West to the Midwest. And it's kind of weird thinking about how many of these Chinese immigrants who came from the southeast coast of China, from the Guangdong province, decided to settle in Chicago, where there's blizzards and it's really cold, whereas in their home country, it was basically like tropical weather. But there are a lot of reasons why they decided to come here instead of staying in the West. One of those was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And the earthquake was very devastating, but it was in fact the fires that led to Chinatown burning down. So many of the early settlers here in Chicago were earthquake refugees, but you could also consider many of them political refugees, because the anti-Chinese sentiment was so high on the West Coast. You can imagine that many of them felt like if they had stayed any longer, they were putting their lives at risk. And then we also have the anti-Chinese movement, which is what I talked about earlier. And this is a quote from Moi Dong Chao, who is considered the founder of Chinatown. And he said, "They never asked me whether or not I ate rats and snakes. They seemed to believe that we also had souls to save, and these souls were worth saving." So from my reading of, the experiences of Chinese people when they first arrived in Chicago, it seemed like they had a lot of interactions with missionaries here. And so when you have an experience like that, and they eagerly want to help you, albeit for kind of racist reasons, and they think that you're heathens and that they can save you if you, convert to Christianity. That was a much better experience than what they had seen on the West Coast. And so as soon as Mo Dong Chao came to Chicago and he realized how much more tolerating the people were, he immediately wrote letters to his friends and family on the West Coast and told them to come to Chicago. So to understand what life was like in Chicago during this time, we need to look at who controlled Chinatown and what associations controlled Chinatown. And one of those were the An Liang Association. The An Liang Association was a merchants organization, and it was a self-contained community structure that was not intended to reach out and blend into larger society. It served as the legislative, judicial, and administrative authority within the Chinese community. So this is a picture of Mo Dong Chao, who I just mentioned earlier. And he and the Moi family operated the An Liang Association. And it was the most powerful merchants association in the country at the time. What is being communicated here, what Hu Pingling means by legislative, judicial, and administrative authority was that because there was so much institutional racism within America, regardless of how tolerating the wider community is. There are still a lot of structures and societal services that did not cater to Chinese people. So that meant they had to create their own laws and rules for governance, and they had to police themselves. They adjudicated disputes between different parties, and then they also punished people. So they served as the courthouse, and the government. Um, let's see, what else do you guys need to know about it? So the Online Association consisted mostly of entrepreneurs, and a lot of them had ties with China, and they conducted a lot of transnational business. And Hu Pingling says that the dominance of the Chinese business class over Chinese immigrants was a pronounced feature of overseas Chinese societies in America. The more self-contained a Chinese immigrant community was, the more indispensable the Chinese business leaders were. Undoubtedly, these Chinese business leaders enjoyed an elite status and endeavored to maintain the established order in the community. So I thought this was very interesting to read because it makes me question if that type of societal structure still exists in Chinatown currently. And what I want this to get you to think about is to think more granularly about what the lived experience of Asian people is like in this country. So I want us to look beyond just the binary between dominant society and ethnic minorities, but think about how certain forms of oppression and discrimination exist even within these ethnic enclaves. And usually when those enclaves are homogenous, those types of oppressions are reproduced along class lines. And this is kind of what she's hinting at. One other person that I want to spotlight from this era is this man named Wang Chenfu. He was a journalist and a civil rights activist, and the first to employ the term Chinese American, and the first to define it. He founded America's first association of Chinese voters and fought for citizenship rights for his countrymen in the United States. And Wang Chenfu is basically a maverick, and he defied what was typically considered of a Chinese person. Because remember, Chinese people held very strong national ties back to their home country. And even if they had decided that they would stay in America long term because of the economic opportunities, they still considered themselves solidly Chinese and that they would never fully integrate with American society for racist reasons, obviously, but also it wasn't, there was no internal desire for it either. Wang Chenfu and a lot of other people who were educated in America, there were a lot of Chinese students, students from China who did study in America during this time. They were much more Americanized, and a lot of them challenged this idea of whether or not Chinese people can be assimilated. He often debated with people about Chinese civil rights issues. And he even attempted to petition for citizenship for 3 of the Moi Klansmen. So what's really interesting about Wang Chenfu is that he starts to open up this kind of conflict about whether or not Chinese people should or can assimilate, or whether it's better to self-segregate. And I think if you talk with Chinese people, even to this day, they would have differing opinions about whether or not it's better to keep to ourselves or to reach out to broader society, because often the implications of assimilation and integration mean a loss of your cultural identity. Another thing that's really interesting about this era is the advent of chop suey. So chop suey originates from real Chinese words, sa sui or sap sui in Cantonese, and it refers to a cuisine that was just like a mix of things, and it was first cooked in Taishan. As a frequent destination for dignitaries, businessmen, and celebrities, Chinese restaurants in Chicago contributed to the national rise of upscale Chinese fine dining. And so chop suey refers to the dish itself, but also this particular type of restaurant that is high class, upscale. And this is an ad from one of those chop suey houses back in the day called Joyet Lo. There's another one called the Mandarin Inn, and then King Joy Lo, I think. Um, and these restaurants were incredibly lavish. There was live music, live dancing, incredibly expensive furniture that was inlaid with marble or mother of pearl. And so we need to ask ourselves, why did this exist? And why doesn't it exist now? Well, chop suey was first introduced in Chicago around the 1893 Columbian exhibition. And it was a way for Chinese business people saw as an opportunity to kind of take advantage of the orientalizing of Chinese people and make money off of it. So there are a lot of other reasons, or a lot of other factors that led to this rapid rise of chop suey houses, and there were probably around at least a dozen or hundreds of them in Chicago at the time, and they were incredibly popular. And the fact that white people were able to eat at this, and important white dignitaries and celebrities, kind of shows how much effort was put into this specific cultural product. So one of the reasons for it was racism. Remember earlier I talked about how these stereotypes of filth and disease and being contagious were affecting Chinese people. If you're a Chinese businessman, obviously not only would it hurt your feelings and get in the way of protecting your civil rights, it was also bad for business. And so you can probably envision these chop suey houses as a response to these stereotypes and a way to compensate for them by showing off how grand Chinese cuisine and Chinese culture can be and how respectable it can be. There was also immigration laws that were affecting it. So the 1882 Exclusion Act might have excluded Chinese laborers, but certainly not merchants. So that meant if you had a certain amount of capital, you were able to immigrate here, but you had to prove that you were operating a high-scale restaurant, which meant that you had to have about $80,000 to $150,000 in today's money. And so there was definitely like a filtering mechanism in our immigration laws. And lastly, there was also prohibition happening around this time. So chop suey restaurants became incredibly popular because they weren't affected by prohibition because they only served tea. And these chop suey restaurants were also complementary to another way that Chinese people can make money, which was through the grocery industry. So there were many grocery businesses when Chinese people first came here. And it was a common way that they found economic mobility because they were able to supply to these restaurants as well as smaller grocery stores. And lastly, I just want to talk about the red light district really quick and just show you this map. So the red light district in Chicago was called the Levee District. And on this map, you see that some of these businesses are colored in red, which means that they were brothels, and some of them were saloons, which are the red boxes. And on the left-hand side of the map, you see Clark Street. And if you remember, Old Chinatown was located on Clark Street, which perfectly shows like how close Chinatown was to all this illegal activity. So these are just some questions to think about, and we'll get to talking about them later on. But think about, how does the advent of cultural tourism reinforce or challenge power structures and structural racism? Also, how do Chinese associations reinforce or challenge structural racism? Okay, I'm gonna take a quick drink. So we get to New Chinatown, which is current day Chinatown. And when Chinatown first moved from the South Loop to the Southwest side, it moved to this small plot of land between Wentworth Avenue, Archer Avenue, and 22nd Street, which is now called Cermak. And this is a picture of Wentworth Avenue a couple decades after that move happened, because you could see the Anliang Association, or what is currently called the Pretext Center, in the background. So what led to this move? There were actually a lot of different factors. One of those factors was overcrowding. As you can imagine, being so close to downtown and the main business districts, there wasn't a lot of space for this burgeoning Chinese community to expand. And there were a lot of people coming over in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And then being so close to the red light district was really bad for business. And then there was also a very violent clash between the two tongs competing for land and business in Chinatown. So Tong is often thought of as a Chinese gang, but it just actually refers to an association, or like a family association. And so the main conflict was between the Anliang Association, or the Anliang Association, and the Hip Sing Association. And the majority of the Chinese businesses who migrated to the Southwest side were part of the Anliang Association. So many of the businesses that resided and stayed in the South Loop were part of the Hip Sing Association. And because they were facing issues like rising rent prices and eminent domain, where there were parts of Clark Street being taken by the government and rebuilt, they were trying to find other places to move to, but they eventually moved to Argyle, which we consider now as the home of Southeast Asian immigrants, but it was actually the home to Chinese immigrants back then. And then lastly, institutional racism played a factor into the move. So right after the Exclusion Acts passed, Chinese people in the South Loop started seeing their rent prices double compared to the businesses next door who weren't operated by Chinese people. And so, having cheaper property on the Southwest side was an attractive business venture. So the next section I want to talk about is the way that Chinatown developed to construct a particular aesthetic and cultural identity. So this part is very abstract, and I'm going to be asking a lot of questions to help guide us through this. So feel free to ask anything if something doesn't seem clear. So some questions to guide us through the way that Chinatown developed to look the way it is now is, why does Chinatown look this way? Is Chinatown authentic? Oh, sorry. Is Chinatown authentic? And why does Chinatown rely on tourism? So why do Chinatowns look this way? Why does every single Chinatown have this really fancy gate at the front of it? So one of these gates, these gateways, is actually not even in North America. You can find them all over in almost any Chinatown, like outside of China. I think there are some in Mexico. There's one in Cuba. There's one in Vancouver, which is the bottom right picture. And actually, I hid a picture in here of a gate that isn't located in a Chinatown. Can you guess which one that is? Anyone want to take a stab? Yeah, that's right. Good job, Joy. The bottom middle is a picture of a paifang that is located in Beijing. And it's the entrance to the Yanghe Temple, which is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. And every other picture is comes from a Chinatown. So the top left is the one in Washington, D.C. The middle top is the one in Chicago. The top right is from Las Vegas. And the bottom left is from San Francisco. And someone pointed this out in a previous workshop. She said, that some of these structures aren't even built by Chinese people. And that's true. I'm not sure about the history of these other ones, but the Pretak Center in Chinatown was actually architected by white architects. So I think they were Swedish or of European descent, but that kind of starts to feed into this idea or this question about what is authentic. And lastly, so the structure is called Taifang, and traditionally it's meant to be used as a symbol for temples, tombs, and palaces, which means that they're meant to be placed in an area or a context that is sacred and holy, right? You typically wouldn't even see these in China unless it's a cemetery or a temple. So when we take these architectural forms and take them out of their context and put them in an area that's next to a gift shop or a grocery store, places that are profane, meaning that they are in the context of everyday life, we change the meaning of what these cultural symbols mean, and we start to construct a new meaning of Asianness. So, you know, Chinatown in Chicago has many, many different buildings and structures that are very orientalizing. And imagine if we took a trip to China, and as soon as we stepped off the plane, all of China looked like this. Wouldn't that be a little bit absurd? And I think the reason why we could recognize the absurdity of that is because we understand that context matters. And the fact that these things exist in Chinatown is something that we shouldn't necessarily take for granted. So I have a couple more questions to help us think about why these things exist. So what is the purpose of having all these things? You can unmute yourself or just type in the chat box. It's okay, it's a safe space. That's a good one. Yeah, so Charlotte says, make Chinatowns recognizable to sell the idea of Chinatown. Matthew, could you explain more by what you mean by selling?
Sure. Like Chinatown is almost like a commercial district and like as its core function beyond just like being the residence of lots of Chinese Americans. So like the thing that brings people to Chinatown, especially historically, is this like faux China almost. Like it's like a transportation, not literally, but like the idea of like you're almost like entering another country. So you need to like play that element up, even if it's unrealistic or inaccurate, especially since the audience in question wouldn't know the difference between real China and fake China.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. So this idea of commercializing an ethnic or cultural identity is certainly plays into the reason why these forms are so prevalent and so like in your face. And this idea that, yeah, you're stepping into the Orient when you come into Chinatown, and you're purchasing an experience by eating at our restaurants. And what should also be understood is that because there are Chinese people here, the existence of Chinese people and these orientalizing looking forms lends to, or it constructs this idea that Chinatown is an authentic experience, and that we are legitimate tour guides for you into this experience. And something else we need to ask ourselves is, who is the audience for these things? Some of us may think that these structures are there to evoke a sense of nostalgia, which I think is a plausible idea. But something that's also interesting is that some of these things actually don't originate from the towns that many of the early Chinese people came from. So The bottom left picture is of the Nine-Wall Dragon on Cermak Avenue, and it's modeled after the Nine-Wall Dragon, the Nine Dragon Wall, sorry, the Nine Dragon Wall. It's modeled after the Nine Dragon Wall in Beijing. And many of the early Chinese immigrants and many of the immigrants who still live in China come from Hong Kong or they come from Guangdong. So when we say that it's there precisely to invoke or evoke nostalgia, that isn't a complete answer because factually that wouldn't be accurate. So we can think of these things existing for consumption for non-Chinese people and for particularly middle-class people who have the disposable income to spend money in this area. So because Chinatown or this Chinese experience is used for commercial reasons, we can interpret that as a response to racism and a response to self-preservation so that Chinese people are able to make an income. And it's a way that they've adapted to their host country and adapted to racism and adapted to the ways that they weren't able to get jobs in other industries because they were seen as taking jobs away from other people. So I think it's kind of interesting that Chinese people have adopted to racism, and this is how they've done it. So there's this question of, is Chinatown authentic? This quote is from Lisa Lowe from her book Immigrant Acts, and she says, "The making of Asian American culture includes practices that are partly inherited, partly modified, as well as partly invented. Asian American culture includes practices that emerge in relation to the dominant representations that deny or subordinate Asian and Asian American cultures as other." So what she's trying to get at here is that culture is not a static thing. And it constantly shifts depending on the context, depending on the history of the way people immigrate. And so we need to accept that this idea that culture, we can't reduce culture down to a set of bullet points, as someone stated earlier in the previous workshop. It can't be distilled down to just what we eat and the buildings that we live in. We have to understand culture as shifting. So this question of, is Chinatown authentic? I'm not going to answer it for you, but you can try to think of answers for yourself. Some things you can use to help answer this question is think about what authentic even means, authentic compared to what else, and also why do we care about authenticity at all? And then lastly, why does Chinatown even rely on tourism? So this is an excerpt from an interview that some researchers did of Chicago's Chinatown from some gift shop owners. So the interviewer asks, "So you represent your culture to tourists?" And the interviewee says, "No, I give them what they want. It doesn't matter what my culture is. Many people here could not tell you what their culture is, but we know what tourists want and we give it to them. We take their attention from negatives of Chinatown to make profit." So reading this and thinking about this very interesting and very honest answer, thank you, Eva. We might want to also ask questions like, okay, if we have such a large tourism industry in Chicago, is tourism even a sustainable industry? And what are the ramifications if we continue to rely on it? And does tourism even solve all the problems related to racism and inequality? So these are some more discussion questions, and then we'll get to more contemporary issues in Chinatown. So what factors inform the identity of Chinatown? What do those factors suggest about the meaning of authenticity? Chinatown is a place that provides the necessities to integrate, but also segregate from larger society. What are the benefits and disadvantages of these competing forces? So next we get to Chinese civic engagement, because there is a lot of history of how Chinatown developed, and that wouldn't have been possible without a lot of unified, collective effort. So while there may be the stereotype of Chinese or Asian people not being politically active, that's certainly not true when you look at what they're doing within their own communities. So there are a lot of organizations within Chinatown currently that provide services to the community. One of them is the Chinese American Service League, which is the largest Asian serving mutual aid organization in the Midwest. We also have the Pretext Center, which is run by the Chinese Christian Union Church, and it acts as a general community space that often provides services to adults and youth. And recently, it's been a vaccination site. We also have the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, CBCAC, and it's probably the only civic or politically oriented organization in Chinatown because they work directly with many of our state and local representatives to ensure that Chinese people, that the needs of Chinese people are being met, that the area is economically developing. So they're heavily involved in those efforts. And then lastly, we have Project Vision, which is a youth empowerment organization, and they often work with middle school and high school students to ensure that they have success in their future. And then we also have two powerful business organizations. Oh, thank you, Dee Dee. One of them is the Chicago Chinatown Chamber of Commerce, and then the Chinatown Parking Corporation. And these are both nonprofit organizations, but they're run by probably some of the most powerful business leaders in the area. So I won't go into too much detail about them, but you can read more about them in a book that I'll recommend later on. And then for this section, the last thing I want to spotlight are some of the important people who have contributed to the community. One of them is Ping Tom. He was a businessman and probably earns the title, I think, unanimously as the father of Chinatown revitalization. It was through his efforts and his constant passions for improving Chinatown that we have things like the parking lots, because at some point it was owned privately and it wasn't available to the public, and he fought very valiantly to make sure that it was available for the whole community to use. And then he was also spearheaded a lot of the development that happened where the Chinatown Square is, as well as the park. And unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the park finish, which is why it's named after him. And then we also have Bernie Wong, who is the founder of Castle. And seeing that she started with just tens of thousands of dollars to provide mutual aid services to her fellow Chinese men and women, she was able to grow this mutual aid association with an operating budget that's in the tens of millions of dollars now. So it's kind of amazing that she was able to do that and vouch for the community so passionately. And unfortunately, these two passed away. But some living community organizers that we have include Representative Teresa Ma, who's the first state representative for Chinatown. And we have Dr. Kim T, who's a podiatrist. Well, he's also very engaged in the community. You could probably find him at any event happening in Chinatown. And he was, I would say, single-handedly responsible for bringing national and international attention when the murder of Ying Zhang happened, because when he heard the news, he realized there wasn't a lot of media attention on it. So he contacted everybody he knew. He contacted the consulate of China in the United States. He contacted all these Chinese organizations to bring attention to this. And so he helped bring justice to her. So this is the discussion question now. So we looked at these already, but I'll just go over them one more time. How does the advent of cultural tourism reinforce or challenge power structures and structural racism? What factors inform the identity of Chinatown, and what do those factors suggest about the meaning of authenticity? How do Chinese associations reinforce power structures and structural racism. And we can think about the old associations that don't exist anymore, like the An Liang Association, or even the most recent ones that I talked about. And then Chinatown is a place that provides necessities to integrate with larger society, but also to segregate from it. What are the benefits and disadvantages? And if you have to go, Megan will share a link for you all to fill out, which is a feedback form. So just let me know like what you thought of the presentation. And there's also links to resources in that form in case you don't make it to the end. So yeah, I'll open it up to discussion. You can either just unmute yourself, actually just raise your hand, and then we'll call on you so you can speak. And you don't have to answer these questions specifically. You could just talk about anything that is on your mind. Charlotte, you raised your hand first.
Sure, thanks. So I'm kind of thinking about the second question, and I thought your discussion of like why Chinatowns look the way they do and kind of the factors that may have led to that were really interesting. And this idea of like the physical appearance being as constructed for like for other people and for like potentially like the white gaze or just non-Asian folks to come. And I just found that really interesting to think about, like, like perhaps a person's perception of Chinatown as, like you mentioned, this idea of authenticity versus that quote that you brought up from someone of like, well, this is just what the tourists like, and we're doing this because it's, essentially financially beneficial. So I found those really interesting, thinking about like the construction of a space and like the factors that lead to it, and thinking about like perhaps other ethnic enclaves and like what ways are they like being constructed for like a quote unquote other versus like for the actual residents, and like how those factors come into play. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, you're next.
Yeah, it was really, first of all, thank you for this presentation. It was really great. But I was really thinking about the associations, and like it was really fascinating to hear about their historical role and just the, not just development, but like the actual governance of Chinatown. So kind of, I guess, my thoughts, and I also, I guess, have a question. You happen to know the answer. I was just like, did they reinforce and challenge those power structures, or challenge them? And like, I guess in my mind, it was a mix of both. Like, I'm sure there was a certain level of necessity to it. Within the race society, you have to figure out a way to like navigate the best you can. And this is kind of the path that Chinatown and Chinatowns generally, I guess, took. So it's interesting to see, though, like when thinking about Chinatown versus other ethnic enclaves, how that may have or may have not played a role in their continued kind of survival and expansion, or at least expansion in the case of Chicago's Chinatown. And just, yeah, just be really, I guess that leads to my question. You mentioned some of the associations, so the Chamber of Commerce and the Parking Corporation. But how much, if you happen to know, like role do these like merchant, particularly like the merchant and commercial associations, have in Chinatown today? Even though Chinatown might not have its own elected representatives, they still have like political influence and involvement in various ways. So I'm like, really what I'm thinking about is like, is that their kind of role today still? Do they still have that kind of authority or power, or is it more disambiguated in all the other organizations, like some of the community service ones you mentioned?
That's a great question. So I'm definitely coming from all of this from the perspective of an outsider as well. Full disclosure, I'm not Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, and I've only recently moved to this area. So I definitely think we need more voices of Chinese people who grew up in this area to really understand what the dynamics are like. But from my understanding, the way that Chinatown was governed back then and still is today is very top-down structure, meaning that almost all of the control is in the hands of people who have the most money, and people who have the best education and are able to speak English. So that is often the case that the business leaders and the professional class who serve on the board of the Chinatown Chamber of Commerce and serve on the board of the Parking Corporation pretty much make all the decisions about how Chinatown develops. And you can think of that as good or bad, but what I'm trying to be unbiased here and just kind of explain the situation. And because of them, we're able to have I would say, a relatively economically prosperous part of the city, where people are able to, make money when they first immigrate here, start working immediately, and they don't necessarily have to go through the challenges of learning English to do it because of tourism. That being said, there are, I think, ways that reinforces racism because it forces Chinatown to be segregated. It reinforces the orientalizing nature of the way people see us. So yeah, the business class certainly has a lot of control over the decisions in Chinatown. And you can read a lot more about that in the biography of Raymond Lee, who was one of the founders of one of the leaders of Chinatown, because he tells stories about how many things that developed in Chinatown, like the park, the Chinatown Square, were all led by the business community, and rarely did they ever ask for input from everybody else. And when they did that, it often caused a lot of anxiety for them because it gave the impression to everybody else who didn't live in Chinatown and to politicians that Chinatown was not a unified and a unified community, and that we were. So they didn't want to give off this impression that we couldn't agree with each other on certain things. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. I could take one more question. If not, I'll count down in case. Oh, okay. Joy, you raised your hand.
Thanks. I was wondering about also gendered relationships and power within, as you were talking about, the microcosm of Chinatown historically, and if you could speak more to that.
Yes, that's a very important thing to look at. I'm trying to think of anything in particular. Well, for current day, oh yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to clarify, particularly in talking about identity.
Okay. Do you have anything more specific, you have in mind, that you're looking answers for?
No.
Okay. 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 So to be fully honest, I haven't explored too much on the way gender is, the way gender plays into the different experiences. I mean, there are a lot of things that changed the way gender impacted people's experiences. So certainly, the exclusion of Chinese women until the 1940s, 40s, and 50s. Let me think. I know that if you read, do I have the book with me? If you read, no, I don't have the book with me. If you read Chinese Chicago by Hu Bingling, she does do a good job of talking about the gender dynamics. I'm trying to think of how gender might have played a role in the way labor was distributed. But I think that what's really common among immigrant communities is that gender isn't as doesn't it doesn't get reinforced through the division of labor as much, because when you're an immigrant and everybody has to work, women ended up working. And so the division of housework and the division of paid work was fairly even between men and women. It wasn't common for Chinese women from China to come to the United States to study in America, but there were a few exceptions. And so the majority of women who came in the early 20th century were just wives, and they helped operate like the laundries and stuff. In terms of current day gender dynamics, I'm not too sure. But that was a great question. And Charlotte, I'll take that last question.
Well, somebody else did have any others they wanted to jump in with. I know I already asked one, so if anybody else take a few seconds.
It's all yours.
Okay, cool. I've read that like a lot of Chinatowns throughout the United States have been subject to a lot of displacement via gentrification, and Chicago is, I wouldn't say unique, but one of the ones where like there's still a large Chinese American presence, and it's been able to in some ways preserve the area for residents, whereas other cities, their Chinatown, we have the structures, and then it just looks like how we imagine a Chinatown looks. And so I'm wondering if you have looked into that at all, or like, are there any factors that had contributed to being able to preserve a community for the residents that were there, and or factors that why in some areas they've been more subject to the like gentrification forces or things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a lot of people who have compared the trends between different Chinatowns across the US. And CBCAC actually spoke with a young researcher recently who was studying Boston's Chinatown. And it was very interesting seeing so many parallels between their Chinatown and ours, because he told us that parts of Chinatown were destroyed due to the construction of an expressway or a highway there. And that happened here in Chinatown. The Dan Ryan Expressway destroyed huge parts of Chinatown, and it destroyed a beloved park that many of the Chinese residents have memories of, and that's no longer there. He also told us that there was a lot of pollution, that many Chinese residents first settled here because the land was cheaper and it was also like polluted. And the reason why, one of the, I think, primary reasons why Chicago's Chinatown was able to survive this long compared to other ones, and not have its residents displaced so much, was because, and this may seem like very obvious, but our Chinatown is located much further away from the main business districts. And it's located in an area that is not as economically developed and hasn't been. And that's quickly changing because the 78 development is literally a stone's throw away. And that is going to be a huge reason why Chinatown is going to face a lot of rises in property taxes. And that's going to cause more displacement of the poor residents. So I think that is like one of the main factors, like just as simple as like being further away from areas that are rapidly developing and causing gentrification to happen. And so, yeah, this is an issue that we're still trying to address and tackle, but gentrification is such, it's like a monster that you don't notice until it's already there. But it's like all the factors that lead to gentrification are like already happening, and so it's kind of hard to address the issue until you actually see people, like large amounts of people being displaced. I don't have any answers, and I can't really speak to it much more, but I will bring this up again later. Thank you for your questions. Okay, we'll move on to the next section, where we talk about the more contemporary issues. happening in Chinatown. So there are a lot of issues to think about. So all of these things they don't just apply to Chinatown, but they manifest in particular ways. So Chinatown is located in the 25th ward, which saw the third highest property tax increase across all of Chicago's wards. And there are also issues related to jobs. The growth rate of unemployment for Asian Americans exceeded that of all others in 2020. So when the pandemic happened, at the height of that, Asian Americans saw the highest spike in unemployment claims in Illinois and probably throughout many of the cities in the United States. And so, like there's this kind of hints at the idea of how economically unstable it is to rely on tourism. And many Asian Americans and Chinese people started seeing this decline even before the country lockdown. Education is still also a barrier. There's still often barriers for education for Chinese Americans here. Asian CPS high school students have the longest average commute out of all racial groups. And so this is just one issue, but it's part of a broader question about education equity and the issues that Asian students are facing and whether or not their needs are being met. And then there's also a high pollution burden on the Southwest side. So Chicago just recently released a report on the air quality of the city, and it found that, unsurprisingly, the West, South, and Southwest areas face the heaviest pollution burden, and these areas are also primarily, they harbor people of color. And so, sorry, hold on. So these issues are very complex, and it's really hard to find a single solution to any of these, and it requires a very in-depth understanding of the community, and it requires people in the community stepping up and taking lead on these issues and giving input on them. And so when you have this kind of issue that requires so many people to have input so that we can come up with the best set of solutions possible that are multifaceted and that attack these issues in different ways, you end up having differing perspectives on the methods for solving these issues. So one of these perspectives, sometimes these perspectives aren't always so positive and sometimes they don't shed a very positive light on the community. So this is a quote from Homan Wong, who's the owner of Dearborn Architects. And he says, "The way you view Chinatown is horrible, dirty. Those are some of the things that I hear a lot from my friends who don't live in Chinatown, especially the young professionals from China who have a tech job. They look at Chinatown as an embarrassment." So compare this with your own perspective of Chinatown. So this was like a very interesting and very candid kind of input from him when asked about like the economic development and the future of Chinatown. And then some other issues affecting the community is racism, of course, that has never gone away. So that includes things like personal prejudice and discrimination, environmental racism, and systemic racism. And also the greater Chinatown area has had a long history of racist attacks happening. There are leaders of Chinatown who are still alive today who could tell you that a couple decades ago, and not even that long ago, you couldn't even go past 23rd Street without running into gangs, without running into people who would chase you down and throw rocks at you and call you horrible slurs. And then another issue is a lack of mainstream civic participation. So Chinatown is very insular, it's very top down, like I mentioned earlier. And there are also information silos on WeChat, which is how most of the Chinese community communicates. So this is a quote from Debbie Liu, who is a Chinese American and community organizer here. She says, "I remember rocks being thrown at me and growing up being called words that are not appropriate for radio. That was difficult because I didn't understand what that meant." So lastly, these are some of the highlights of what's happening in Chinatown to address these issues, or not just Chinatown, but like more broadly. So one of the solutions people have come up with is commodification. So this has always kind of been around because Chinese tourism has been around for a long time. There's also an organization called Celebrate Argyle, which is located on the north side, but it's still is consistent with this kind of trend of commodification. And their primary job is to, I think, give Argyle a bit of a modern facelift to attract people to their businesses and continue to frequent them so that they don't lose revenue. And there's something called the Asian American Baker's Box, which I found out through a friend. So this is a box of goods, and you're paying $100 for 9 different snack size items. And those proceeds go to certain Asian American organizations. And I think this is like a response to the wave of anti-Asian racism. So I thought this was an interesting way to address this issue. There are also grassroots organizations. And how I define grassroots is that these are efforts geared more toward giving direct aid and interacting with people to provide them of something of direct value. So there are political education workshops like myself, and also CBCAC gives really like interesting political education seminars sometimes. There are food banks happening in the area that help large Chinese populations. There's the Chinatown Peace Project, which is led by the Chinese Christian Union Church. And they were founded to address the wave of anti-Asian racism and to address public safety concerns. And then we also have political efforts. So redistricting is going to be a huge thing in the coming months. There was a huge effort to get Asians counted in the census. CPCAC and Advancing Justice, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, often have voter outreach phone banks for Asian communities specifically. We also have a small organization called Chicago Asian Americans for Environmental Justice. We have the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, as well as the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which addresses a lot of gendered violence and gendered racism. And there are even organizations popping up that are trying to address issues of cross-racial solidarity specifically. So there's an organization called People Matter. The Chinese Christian Union Church is actually starting to address these issues by bringing in fellow congregations in neighboring communities. We have an organization called Chinatown Hip Hop, as well as Not Us. And Not Us just had their launch party, so they're very new as well. Okay, so here's some more discussion questions. We probably only have like 5 minutes for this, and then if anybody needs to leave, they can go. So I'll just run over these questions really quick. So why does Chinatown face so many problems? Who is accountable for the problems facing Chinatown and Asian Chicagoans? What does it mean that there are conflicting ideas about the future of Chinatown? How would people's lives be impacted if there were no Chinatowns? Who matters? And who should have the power to shape Chicago Chinatown's future? So you can just raise your hand if you have any thoughts about this. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks. I mean, for number two, like who's accountable for this? I mean, I don't know if I like the question too much because I feel like I'm pointing fingers at like, oh, they're responsible. But I think it seems to be a result, like a few of these problems that you brought up. It seems to be a result of like one thing of like how insular Chinatown is, like how you keep bringing up how like oh let's keep to ourselves, like and don't rock the boat. But then that means like not having a seat in like the city council, like you brought up, which can have a lot of sway into like getting a high school built for Chinatown, for example. So it seems like getting more involved in politics would help alleviate some of these, or at least help improve it.
Yeah, I heavily agree with that sentiment. This is like, I kind of phrased it in a spicy way, right? I could have phrased it in a different
right.
way. But yeah, like I could phrase it more like what factors led to all these problems happening. But I definitely think that there needs to be at least a critical analysis of what entities are responsible for causing these problems. And they don't necessarily have to be people, but sometimes it is people because politicians are very powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? Charlotte.
So one thing I'm thinking about is, you mentioned the lack of political representation, and I think, as it just alluded to, like political involvement could potentially be, a helpful route to address some issues. I'm wondering if you have any comments on how much do you think that is like by design that there isn't Asian representation, or districts haven't been divided in such a way, or there hasn't been outreach or what have you, and how much of it is just a casualty of I guess just the way politics runs, or things like that. I mean, we could point to a lot of historical factors that lead to like segregation issues and things of like some of the problems we have today are by design. And so I'm guessing, how much do we think that has played a role in the lack of political Asian representation in politics in Chicago area?
I actually think there are certain people who would know how to answer this better than me, but I think there's a reason why Theresa Ma was only recently elected in 2016, even though this community has been here for over 100 years. And I think the state, the boundaries for the different state districts had gerrymandered the Chinese community so much that it was hard for them to have enough political power to elect a Chinese representative. I don't know exactly how it was split up, but Theresa Ma, prior to getting elected, had done a lot of effort in making sure that they were able to apply the civil rights legislation in a way that allowed the Chinese, that allowed the ballots on elections to be translated in Chinese. And there is a specific phrase for it, but because they were able to get things like that, get translation, because they were able to make sure that the redistricting in 2010 was fair to the Chinese residents, that it wasn't until then that they were able to get the Chinese community a representative. So sometimes I think that a lot of the inequality that Chinese people face is a product of people just not knowing that Asian people exist. And I see that, and I think that because I see even now that even in organizing spaces and large campaigns happening on a national scale, there is a very clear just like neglect of Asian people, and not just Asian people on the ground, but even Asian organizations that are working on the same issues. So a lot of it is intentional and by design, but I also think a lot of it is just simply because people don't think of Asian people as having like enough power worth leveraging for certain campaigns and goals. But, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, I think like because Asian people are growing in this country and we're the fastest growing ethnic group, I hope that like certain parties and campaigns start to realize like how much of a difference getting Asian people involved can make in elections, because it certainly has on the West Coast, and that's going to apply more and more as the population continues to grow. So we're past 7:30. The last thing I have for you all are, oh, I'm sorry, what is going on? Okay, the last thing I have for you all is just like a bunch of resources that you can use to further your education, but feel free to hop off whenever. Just make sure you have the link to fill out the feedback form, because it also includes some of this information. So some things you can do to read more about Chicago Chinatown is purchase or check out Hu Ping Ling's Chinese Chicago. It's available at the Chicago Public Library. You can also read Growing Up in Chicago's Chinatown by Raymond Lee. Matthew, this was the book that I had mentioned about how there's like these stories of these business communities, like making these decisions on behalf of everyone else and not getting any of their input. And some studies that I found very interesting that delves more into this question of authenticity and like identity making are by Chua Lee and Santos and Yan. And then I also encourage people to donate to these organizations that are based here in Chinatown, because they provide direct aid to the community. So you know that for the most part that people's lives are going to be benefited by your donation. And something that I've noticed after all of this all of these waves of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian violence, most people's de facto or default organization to donate to is Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I just want to remind people that Advancing Justice is an advocacy organization, and they don't actually directly address the issues of public safety and violence directly in these communities, because sometimes or oftentimes they don't even talk to the members of the Chinatown community. So please donate to these organizations. And then also ways to engage, you can visit the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. I think they're usually only open during the weekend, so it kind of makes it hard to access. But if you're able to, go there, it's really cool. And you can also purchase those books I mentioned there. Volunteer for any of these organizations. The CBCAC is having an orientation, so you're welcome to come, and it's for a anti-displacement group where we're going to try to learn and talk about how gentrification is going to impact the community. And then also join the Chicago Bridgeport Chinatown Facebook group to get any updates on what's going on, and then start thinking about the elections that are happening. So that's everything. So make sure you fill out that feedback form. Share this event with your friends and family. I still have tomorrow and Thursday that I'm giving this presentation. And then also follow me on Instagram and check out my website where I give some updates on what I'm doing. So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you sticking to the end. You're welcome to sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was so great.
Thank you. I'm just going to hang out here if you guys want to talk, but if not, that's okay. Thank you, Charlotte. Cool. All right.